Hello everyone, I am the Creeping Chill, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. Story 1, The Hollow Echoes. The town of Ashbourne was nestled deep within the rolling hills of a remote countryside, surrounded by dense, ancient forests that had long been shrouded in mystery and superstition. It was a place where the past clung to the present like a ghost, where every creaking floorboard and whispering wind seemed to carry the echoes of long-forgotten secrets. The townsfolk were a quiet, reserved bunch, their lives revolving around the rhythms of the land and the cycles of the seasons. They were friendly enough to outsiders, but there was always a sense of something unspoken hanging in the air, a weight of unshared knowledge that kept them guarded. At the heart of the town, on a small rise overlooking the village square, stood an old, weathered mansion known as Hollow Manor. The mansion had been abandoned for years, ever since its last inhabitant, the reclusive and enigmatic Lord Ainsley, had vanished without a trace one cold winter night. The disappearance of Lord Ainsley had been the subject of much speculation and rumor among the townsfolk. Some said he had gone mad and wandered off into the woods. Others believed he had been taken by the spirits that were said to haunt the mansion. But no one knew for certain, and the mystery of his fate only added to the aura of dread that surrounded Hollow Manor. For decades, the mansion had stood empty, its windows dark and its doors sealed shut. The townsfolk avoided it at all costs, and it became a place of legend, a source of fear and fascination for generations of children who dared each other to approach its crumbling facade. But as the years passed, the mansion began to fade from the collective memory of the town, becoming little more than a footnote in Ashbourne's history. That all changed one summer when a young couple, Claire and Daniel Holloway, moved to Ashbourne from the city. They were drawn to the town by its picturesque beauty and the promise of a quiet, simple life. Claire was a writer, seeking inspiration for her next novel, and Daniel was a historian with a passion for uncovering the secrets of the past. When they heard about Hollow Manor, they were immediately intrigued. The mansion, with its rich history and air of mystery, seemed like the perfect place for them to settle down and pursue their passions. Despite the warnings of the townsfolk, who told them that the mansion was cursed and that no good would come of living there, Claire and Daniel were undeterred. They purchased the property at a bargain price, and soon after, they moved in. The mansion was in a state of disrepair, but they saw potential in its faded grandeur. They set about restoring it, determined to breathe new life into its dusty halls. The first few weeks in the mansion were idyllic. Claire found herself inspired by the eerie beauty of the place, and Daniel spent his days exploring the mansion's many rooms and poring over old documents and artifacts he found in the attic. But as the summer days began to shorten and the shadows grew longer, strange things started to happen. It began with small, almost imperceptible occurrences. A door that had been closed would be found open, or a light that had been switched off would flicker on. At first, Claire and Daniel dismissed these events as the quirks of an old house, the result of drafts or faulty wiring. But as the days passed, the disturbances became more frequent and more unsettling. One night, Claire was working late in her study when she heard a faint whispering sound. At first, she thought it was the wind rustling through the trees outside, But as she listened more closely, she realized that the sound was coming from inside the room. It was a soft, low murmur, as if someone was speaking just out of earshot. She looked around the room, but there was no one there. The whispering continued, growing louder and more insistent, until it seemed to fill the entire room. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. Shaken, Claire tried to rationalize what had happened. Perhaps she had been so absorbed in her work that her mind had played tricks on her, or maybe it was the house settling, producing noises that her brain had interpreted as whispers. But deep down, she knew that something was not right. The next day, Claire mentioned the incident to Daniel, expecting him to brush it off as her imagination. But to her surprise, he looked troubled. "I've been hearing things too," he admitted. "Voices, footsteps. I thought I was going crazy." They exchanged uneasy glances, realizing that whatever was happening in the house was not just a figment of their imaginations. The disturbances continued to escalate. Objects would move on their own. Strange smells would waft through the house, and they both began to experience vivid, terrifying nightmares. It was as if the house itself was alive, its very walls pulsing with a malevolent energy. One evening, as they were sitting in the living room, trying to distract themselves with a movie, the power suddenly went out. The room was plunged into darkness, and they both felt a chill run down their spines. As they fumbled for a flashlight, they heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps coming from the floor above. Daniel grabbed a candlestick from the mantel and lit it, the flickering flame casting eerie shadows on the walls. They made their way upstairs, the sound of the footsteps growing louder with each step. When they reached the top of the stairs, they saw that the door to one of the guest bedrooms was ajar, and a faint light was spilling out into the hallway. With a sense of dread, they approached the door and pushed it open. The room was empty, but the air was thick with a palpable sense of unease. The light was coming from an old, cracked mirror that hung on the wall opposite the bed. As they stared at the mirror, they saw a figure reflected in its glass, a shadowy, indistinct form that seemed to be watching them. Claire let out a gasp, and Daniel quickly shut the door. They retreated downstairs, their hearts pounding with fear. "We need to leave," Claire said, her voice shaking. "This place isn't safe." But Daniel was reluctant. "We can't just abandon the house. We put everything we have into this place. We'll lose more than just our investment if we stay here," Claire replied, her eyes wide with terror. "There's something in this house, Daniel. Something evil." Daniel knew she was right, but he couldn't bring himself to leave. The historian in him was captivated by the mystery of the mansion, by the possibility of uncovering its dark secrets. He spent the next few days researching the history of Hollow Manor, poring over old newspapers and town records. What he found only deepened his sense of unease. The mansion had a long and troubled history. It had been built in the late 1800s by a wealthy industrialist named Samuel Hollow, who had made his fortune in the steel industry. Hollow Manor was meant to be a testament to his success, a grand estate where he could entertain high society and live out his days in luxury. But Samuel Hollow was a cruel and ruthless man, known for his harsh treatment of his workers and his unscrupulous business practices. As the years passed, the mansion became the site of numerous tragedies. Samuel's wife, Eleanor, died under mysterious circumstances, her body found at the bottom of the grand staircase. Their only son, Edward, disappeared one night, never to be seen again, and Samuel himself was rumored to have gone mad in his later years. locking himself in the mansion and refusing to see anyone. When he died, the mansion passed to a series of distant relatives, none of whom stayed for long. There were also stories of strange occurrences in the house, doors that would lock on their own, furniture that would move without explanation, and apparitions that would appear in mirrors and windows. The townsfolk believed that the mansion was cursed, that the spirits of those who had died there were trapped within its walls, doomed to haunt it for all eternity. As Daniel delved deeper into the history of the mansion, he began to feel a growing sense of dread. The more he learned, the more he became convinced that the disturbances they were experiencing were not just the result of their imaginations. There was something in the house, something that had been awakened by their presence. One night, as Daniel was going through some old letters he had found in the attic, he came across one that caught his eye. It was a letter from Samuel Hollow to a friend, dated shortly before his death. In it, Samuel spoke of a strange artifact he had acquired, a small, intricately carved box that he believed had the power to grant wishes. But the box, he wrote, came with a terrible price. Those who used it would be cursed, their souls bound to the box for all eternity. Samuel's letter described how he had used the box to amass his fortune, but at a great cost. His wife and son had paid the price for his greed, their souls trapped in the box, doomed to haunt the mansion for as long as it stood. Samuel himself had been driven mad by the guilt, and he had hidden the box somewhere in the mansion, hoping to break the curse. Daniel felt a chill run down his spine as he read the letter. Could it be that the box was still in the house, its dark power still at work? He knew that if they were to find it, they might be able to end the curse and free the trapped souls. The next day, Daniel told Claire about the letter and his theory, though she was reluctant to believe that an old artifact could be the cause of the horrors they were experiencing. Still, the growing intensity of the disturbances in the mansion left them with few options. They needed a solution, and this cursed box seemed to be the key. "We need to find it," Daniel insisted. "If what Samuel Hollow wrote is true, it might be our only way out of this nightmare." Claire, still shaken by the experiences of the previous nights, reluctantly agreed. Together, they began searching the mansion for any sign of the box. They combed through every room, scoured every nook and cranny, but the mansion was vast, and its labyrinthine layout made the search painstakingly slow. Days passed, and the oppressive atmosphere of the house seemed to weigh heavier on them with each passing hour. As they delved deeper into the mansion, it became clear that the house itself was resisting them. The whispering voices grew louder, more mocking, and the strange occurrences became more violent. Doors would slam shut behind them, trapping them in rooms for hours. Objects would fly off shelves, narrowly missing their heads. They would hear footsteps behind them, but when they turned, no one would be there. The mirrors, too, began to play tricks on them, reflecting not just their own faces, but twisted, grotesque figures standing just behind them. One night, after hours of fruitless searching, they retired to the master bedroom, exhausted and demoralized. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, and the old mansion seemed to creak and groan as if alive. They huddled together in the bed, trying to find comfort in each other's presence. But sleep eluded them. The house was not going to let them rest. In the dead of night, Claire awoke with a start. The room was pitch black, but she could feel something in the room with them, a presence so malevolent that it made her skin crawl. She reached out to wake Daniel, but her hand froze mid-air. At the foot of the bed, she saw a figure standing in the darkness. It was a woman, her face obscured by shadows, but Claire could feel the weight of her gaze. "Who are you?" Claire whispered, her voice trembling. The figure said nothing, but as she stepped closer, Claire could see her more clearly. The woman was dressed in a tattered, old-fashioned nightgown, her hair a tangled mess. Her eyes were hollow and sunken, her skin pale and translucent. There was an overwhelming sadness in her expression, but also something else, an unbridled rage that seemed to radiate from her very being. Claire felt paralyzed with fear, unable to move or call out. The woman reached out a hand, her fingers long and skeletal, and as she touched Claire's arm, a cold, searing pain shot through her. Claire gasped, the pain waking Daniel, who bolted upright in bed. "What's wrong?" Daniel asked, panic in his voice as he saw the terror on Claire's face. But before Claire could answer, the woman vanished, dissolving into the darkness as if she had never been there. Claire was shaking uncontrollably, her heart pounding in her chest. She looked down at her arm, where the woman had touched her, and saw a dark, bruise-like mark forming, a handprint burned into her flesh. "We have to get out of here," Claire said, her voice barely a whisper. "This place is cursed." But as they prepared to leave, they heard a sound that stopped them in their tracks. A faint, rhythmic tapping, like fingernails drumming on wood. It was coming from the walls, surrounding them, closing in. The noise grew louder, more insistent, and then the floor beneath them began to tremble, as if something massive was moving beneath the house. Daniel grabbed Claire's hand and pulled her toward the door, but before they could reach it, the entire house shuddered violently. The lights flickered, and the walls seemed to close in around them. They could hear the voices again, louder than ever, screaming in agony and rage, a cacophony of despair that threatened to drive them mad. In a desperate attempt to escape, they fled down the hallway, the walls warping and twisting around them, as if the house were trying to trap them within its bowels. They reached the staircase, but as they descended, the steps seemed to stretch on endlessly, spiraling downward into darkness. The mansion was no longer just a house. It was a labyrinth, a living entity that wanted to consume them. But just as hope began to fade, they saw a faint light ahead, a small, flickering candle burning on a table in the foyer. They raced toward it, and as they approached, they saw something that made their hearts skip a beat. An old, dusty box, intricately carved with strange symbols, sitting on the table beneath the candlelight. Daniel hesitated for only a moment before reaching for the box. The moment his fingers touched it, the entire house seemed to tremble, and the air around them grew heavy with an almost tangible sense of malevolence. He knew instinctively that this was the box mentioned in Samuel Hollow's letter, the cursed artifact that had caused so much suffering. With trembling hands, Daniel opened the box. Inside, he found a small, worn key and a faded piece of parchment. The parchment contained a single line of text, written in an elegant, flowing script. The debt must be paid. Suddenly, the whispering voices returned, louder and more frenzied than ever. The house began to shake violently, as if it were about to collapse in on itself. Daniel grabbed the key and the parchment, and they fled the foyer, racing back up the stairs to the master bedroom. "We have to find out what this key unlocks," Daniel said, his voice barely audible over the din of the house. "It's our only chance." They frantically searched the bedroom, looking for anything that might correspond to the key. Finally, Claire spotted a small, ornate chest hidden beneath the bed. Daniel fit the key into the lock, and with a click, the chest opened. Inside the chest was a stack of old letters, yellowed with age, and a small, hand-carved figurine of a woman. The letters were addressed to Samuel Hollow, and as Daniel quickly skimmed through them, he realized they were from Eleanor, Samuel's wife. The letters spoke of her despair, her fear of Samuel, and her growing suspicion that something was terribly wrong with him. In the final letter, written just days before her death, Eleanor revealed the truth. Samuel had used the cursed box to amass his fortune, but the price for his greed had been their son's life. In her letter, Eleanor begged Samuel to destroy the box, to end the curse before it consumed them all. But Samuel had been too far gone, his mind twisted by the dark power of the box. He had hidden the box and locked it away, believing that as long as it was sealed, the curse would be contained. But the spirits of those who had died because of the box remained trapped, their suffering feeding the malevolent energy that now permeated the mansion. Claire and Daniel realized that they had to do what Samuel could not. They had to destroy the box and free the trapped souls. But how? The house was crumbling around them, the malevolent force growing stronger by the second. They could feel the spirits closing in on them, their rage and despair palpable. In a moment of clarity, Claire remembered the fireplace in the living room. Fire, she thought, might be their only chance. She grabbed the box and the figurine, and they raced downstairs, dodging falling debris as the house seemed to collapse around them. The living room was in shambles, the walls buckling and the ceiling sagging, but the fireplace was still intact. Claire threw the box and the figurine into the flames, and as the fire consumed them, a deafening scream echoed through the house, a sound of pure, unbridled agony, as if the very soul of the mansion was being torn apart. The fire roared, the flames reaching higher and higher, and the entire house shook violently. The voices of the spirits rose to a fever pitch, their cries filling the air with a terrible, mournful wail. Claire and Daniel huddled together, praying that they had made the right choice. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the shaking stopped. The flames in the fireplace died down, and an eerie silence fell over the house. The oppressive weight that had hung in the air was gone, and the mansion, once a living entity of malevolence, now felt empty, lifeless. They cautiously made their way outside, stepping into the cool night air. The house behind them stood silent, dark, and still. The curse had been lifted, the trapped souls finally freed. But as they turned to leave, Daniel noticed something strange. The handprint on Claire's arm, the bruise left by the ghostly woman, had not faded. In fact, it seemed to have darkened, the outline of the fingers becoming more pronounced, almost as if it were burned into her skin. And then, as they stood there, catching their breath, Claire felt a cold, creeping sensation crawl up her spine. She looked back at the mansion, her heart sinking as she realized that something was still very wrong. The windows of the mansion, dark and lifeless just moments ago, were now glowing faintly, and from deep within the house they heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping, like fingernails drumming on wood, growing louder and louder. The curse, it seemed, was far from broken. The moment the tapping sound reached their ears, Daniel and Claire froze, the sense of dread washing over them once more. They had hoped that the destruction of the box would be the end of their ordeal, that the souls trapped within Hollow Manor would find peace and leave the mansion to rot in peace. but the eerie glow emanating from the windows and the rhythmic tapping suggested otherwise. It was as if the mansion was calling them back, refusing to let them go. "We have to leave," Claire whispered, her voice trembling with fear. She clutched her arm where the ghostly handprint had darkened, the cold seeping into her bones. "We can't stay here, Daniel." Daniel nodded, though his eyes were fixed on the mansion. "You're right. Let's get in the car and drive. We can't risk staying here any longer." They hurried to the car, parked just beyond the overgrown garden that surrounded the mansion. The air was thick with an unnatural silence, broken only by the sound of their footsteps crunching on the gravel. Claire fumbled with the keys, her hands shaking, as Daniel kept glancing back at the house, half expecting to see a shadowy figure in one of the windows. Finally, Claire managed to unlock the car, and they both scrambled inside. Daniel started the engine, the sound loud and jarring in the stillness of the night. As they pulled away from the mansion, Claire looked back one last time, hoping to see the house recede into the darkness. But instead, she saw the glow from the windows intensify, as if the house itself was alive, pulsating with a malevolent energy. "Drive faster," she urged, her voice tight with panic. "We need to get as far away from here as possible." Daniel pressed down on the accelerator, the car speeding down the narrow road that led away from the mansion. The trees on either side of the road seemed to close in on them, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal hands. The tapping sound, which had been faint before, now echoed in their minds, growing louder and more insistent, as if the house was chasing them, refusing to let them escape. As they drove through the night, the tapping transformed into something more sinister, a heartbeat, slow and deliberate, pounding in their ears. Claire pressed her hands to her head, trying to block out the sound, but it was useless. The heartbeat was inside her, reverberating through her skull, syncing with her own pulse. "Daniel, make it stop," she cried, her voice cracking. "I can't take it anymore." But Daniel could only grip the steering wheel tighter, his knuckles white. He could hear it too, the relentless heartbeat that seemed to emanate from the very air around them. It was as if the house had imprinted itself on them, a curse that they couldn't outrun. "Hold on," Daniel said, his voice strained. "We'll find help. We'll—" Suddenly, the car's headlights flickered, and the engine sputtered. Daniel cursed under his breath, trying to coax more speed out of the car, but it was no use. The dashboard lights dimmed, and the car began to slow, despite his efforts. "No, no, no," Daniel muttered, desperation creeping into his voice. "This can't be happening." The car rolled to a stop in the middle of the road, the engine dead. The heartbeat in their ears grew louder, almost deafening now. Claire clutched her head, her breaths coming in short, panicked gasps. "Why is this happening?" she whimpered, tears streaming down her face. "We destroyed the box. We freed them. Why won't it stop?" Daniel didn't have an answer. He tried the ignition again and again, but the car remained stubbornly still, the engine refusing to turn over. The tapping, the heartbeat, seemed to mock them, a constant reminder that they were still in the grip of whatever malevolent force haunted the mansion. "We need to get out of the car," Daniel said finally, his voice trembling. "Maybe it's the car that's been affected. We'll walk back to town and get help." Claire looked at him with wide, fearful eyes. "And go where? What if it follows us?" "We don't have a choice," Daniel said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "We can't stay here." Reluctantly, Claire nodded, and they both got out of the car, The night air was cold, a biting chill that seeped into their bones. The road stretched out before them, a ribbon of black cutting through the dense forest. There was no sign of civilization, no distant lights to indicate a nearby town. They were alone, trapped in the darkness, with the ever-present heartbeat echoing in their minds. They began to walk, their footsteps echoing in the silence. The road was uneven, the asphalt cracked and worn, as if it hadn't been maintained in years. The forest on either side of them seemed to press in closer, the trees swaying in the wind, their branches whispering secrets that only the night could understand. The heartbeat continued, a relentless rhythm that matched their steps. Claire felt her fear growing with every passing moment. The mark on her arm throbbed painfully, as if the handprint was burning into her skin, a brand that tied her to the mansion, no matter how far they tried to run. "Daniel, I don't think we're getting away from it," Claire said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's following us. I can feel it." Daniel didn't respond, but his silence spoke volumes. He could feel it too, a presence that seemed to hang over them, watching, waiting. The road ahead looked endless, as if they were walking in place, no closer to safety than when they had started. After what felt like hours, they finally saw a faint light in the distance, a small, flickering glow that cut through the darkness. Claire's heart leapt with hope. "Look, there's something up ahead," she said, pointing. Daniel squinted, trying to make out what the light could be. As they drew closer, they saw that it was coming from a small, dilapidated house on the side of the road. The light flickered from a single candle burning in the window, casting long shadows that danced across the peeling walls. "Maybe someone's inside," Daniel said, though there was uncertainty in his voice. "Maybe they can help us." Claire hesitated. The house looked old, abandoned, and something about it set her on edge. But the alternative was to keep walking down the endless road, with the heartbeat growing louder in their ears. They had to take the chance. They approached the house cautiously, the wooden steps creaking under their weight as they climbed the porch. Daniel knocked on the door, but there was no answer. He knocked again, harder this time, and the door creaked open on its own. "Hello?" Daniel called out, but there was only silence. The inside of the house was dark, save for the candle in the window. The air was thick with the smell of damp wood and decay. Claire shivered, her unease growing. "We shouldn't be here," she whispered. "This place doesn't feel right." But Daniel stepped inside, driven by desperation. "We don't have anywhere else to go," he said, his voice echoing in the empty house. The twisted versions of Claire and Daniel, grotesque and malevolent, moved closer with every passing second. Their hollow eyes seemed to bore into the souls of their living counterparts, as if searching for the deepest, darkest fears to exploit. Claire's heart pounded in her chest, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The cold that had seeped into her bones was now unbearable, as if the doppelganger's presence was draining the life out of her. She wanted to run, to flee from the horrors before her, but her feet felt rooted to the spot, paralyzed by the sheer terror that gripped her. Daniel, too, was frozen in place, his mind racing for a way out. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't tear his eyes away from the twisted version of himself that stood just inches away, grinning with a malice that sent chills down his spine. The heartbeat that had haunted them since they left the mansion now filled the room, echoing in the darkness like a death knell. Then, without warning, the doppelgangers lunged. Daniel barely had time to react as his mirror image grabbed him by the throat, its grip like iron. He gasped for air, his hands clawing at the ghostly fingers that squeezed tighter and tighter. He could feel the cold seeping into his skin, his vision blurring as his strength began to wane. Claire screamed, trying to pull her doppelganger away from Daniel, but it was no use. The twisted version of herself was equally relentless, its bony fingers wrapping around her wrists with a vice-like grip. The touch burned like ice, and Claire felt her strength draining away, as if the very life was being sucked out of her. Just when it seemed like they were about to be overpowered, a sudden blinding light filled the room. The mirror, cracked and tarnished, now glowed with an otherworldly brilliance. The doppelgangers recoiled, hissing like feral creatures as the light intensified, their forms flickering and distorting. Claire and Daniel collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath as the light washed over them. They watched in disbelief as their doppelgangers writhed in agony, their bodies twisting and contorting in unnatural ways. The mirror's light grew brighter and brighter until it was almost unbearable, and with a final, ear-piercing scream, the doppelgangers were sucked back into the mirror, disappearing into the glass as if they had never existed. The room was plunged back into darkness, the only sound the ragged breathing of Claire and Daniel as they lay on the floor, too weak to move. The mirror, once glowing with a blinding light, now stood dark and silent, its surface smooth and unbroken. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The air was thick with tension, the memory of what had just happened too fresh, too terrifying. Finally, Claire managed to find her voice, though it was barely more than a whisper. "Daniel, what just happened?" Daniel shook his head, still trying to make sense of the events. "I don't know," he said, his voice hoarse. "But I think the mirror saved us." Claire frowned, her brow furrowing in confusion. "But how? Why would it help us?" Before Daniel could respond, the door to the room creaked open, and they both jumped, their hearts racing. But instead of another apparition, they saw a figure standing in the doorway, an elderly woman, her face lined with age, her eyes filled with a sadness that seemed to weigh on her like a heavy burden. "Who are you?" Claire asked, her voice trembling. The woman stepped into the room, her movement slow and deliberate, as if she carried the weight of the world on her shoulders. "My name is Eleanor," she said softly. "I am, or was, the mistress of this house." Claire and Daniel exchanged a glance. They recognized the name from the letters they had found in the mansion. This was Samuel Hollow's wife, the woman who had suffered so much because of the cursed box. You're a ghost?" Daniel asked, though the answer seemed obvious. Eleanor nodded, her eyes filled with sorrow. "I have been trapped here for many years, bound to this house by the curse that my husband unleashed. The box you destroyed was the source of the curse, but its destruction was only the beginning." "The beginning?" Claire echoed, dread creeping into her voice. "What do you mean?" Eleanor sighed, the sound filled with centuries of regret. "The box was a vessel for the curse, but it was not the curse itself. The curse was born from the greed and evil that consumed my husband, and it tainted everything it touched, including this house and all who lived in it. Even now, the curse lingers, clinging to the very walls of this place, feeding on the fear and despair of those who enter." Daniel felt a chill run down his spine. "Then how do we stop it? How do we end this once and for all?" Eleanor looked at them with a mixture of hope and sorrow. The mirror, she said, gesturing to the object that had saved them moments ago. It is a portal, a gateway between this world and the next. It is the only way to reach the heart of the curse and destroy it. But it's just a mirror, Claire said, her voice wavering. How can it do all that? Eleanor gave her a sad smile. The mirror was enchanted long ago by those who sought to contain the curse. It is a powerful artifact, but it is also dangerous. If you enter the mirror, you will be entering the realm of the curse itself. It will do everything in its power to stop you, to consume you. Daniel and Claire exchanged a worried glance. The idea of entering the mirror, of facing the curse head-on, was terrifying. But what choice did they have? They couldn't continue running forever. The curse would follow them, haunt them, until it consumed them completely. What do we need to do? Daniel asked, his voice filled with determination. Eleanor nodded, a look of approval in her eyes. You must step into the mirror. Once inside, you will find yourselves in the realm of the curse. It will take the form of your worst fears, your deepest regrets. You must confront these fears, face them head-on, and find the source of the curse. Only then can you destroy it and free this house and yourselves from its grip. Claire's heart pounded in her chest. The thought of facing her worst fears was almost too much to bear. But she knew they had no other option. What happens if we fail? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Eleanor's expression darkened. If you fail, the curse will consume you, body and soul. You will become part of it, trapped in the mirror for all eternity, just like so many before you. The weight of her words hung in the air, heavy and oppressive. Daniel took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. We'll do it, he said, his voice filled with resolve. We'll enter the mirror and destroy the curse. Eleanor nodded, though there was a trace of sadness in her eyes. You are brave, both of you. I wish I could join you, but I am bound to this house. My fate was sealed long ago. Claire reached out and took Daniel's hand, holding on tightly. We'll end this, she said, her voice trembling with fear, but also with determination. We'll free you. Eleanor gave them a grateful smile. Thank you, she said softly. May you find the strength to face what lies ahead. With that, she stepped back, allowing them to approach the mirror. The surface of the glass was still dark, reflecting only their own pale, frightened faces. But as they stepped closer, the mirror began to ripple, as if the glass was turning to liquid. Daniel squeezed Claire's hand, giving her a reassuring look. We'll do this together, he said. Claire nodded, though her heart was pounding in her chest. Together, she echoed. Taking a deep breath, they stepped forward into the mirror. The glass gave way beneath them, and they were pulled into a swirling vortex of darkness and light, the world around them dissolving into a chaotic whirlwind of sound and color. And then, with a final, blinding flash, they were gone. They found themselves standing in a vast, barren landscape, the sky above them a sickly shade of red. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and the ground beneath their feet was cracked and dry, as if it hadn't seen rain in centuries. This must be the realm of the curse, Daniel said, his voice barely audible in the oppressive silence. Claire looked around, her heart sinking at the sight of the desolate wasteland. It's horrible, she whispered. How are we supposed to find the source of the curse in a place like this? As if in response to her question, the ground beneath them began to tremble, and they both stumbled as the earth cracked open, revealing a deep chasm. From the depths of the chasm, a thick, black fog began to rise, swirling around them like a living thing. Daniel grabbed Claire's hand, pulling her back from the edge of the chasm. "We have to keep moving," he said urgently. "Whatever that is, it's not friendly." They began to run, the black fog swirling after them, growing thicker and more suffocating with each passing moment. The landscape around them shifted and changed, the ground beneath their feet crumbling away, forcing them to leap from one precarious lead. Claire and Daniel leaped from one precarious ledge to another, the ground beneath them disintegrating into nothingness as the black fog chased them, relentless and suffocating. Every time they looked back, the fog seemed to pulse with malevolent energy, tendrils reaching out as if trying to drag them into the chasm that had opened behind them. Their breaths came in ragged gasps, their bodies fueled by sheer terror as they continued to flee through the barren, ever-shifting landscape. The sky overhead darkened, the sickly red deepening into a black void that threatened to swallow them whole. The heartbeat they had been hearing since the mansion now pounded louder, resonating through the ground and the very air around them, as if the curse itself had a pulse, alive and hunting them. "Daniel!" Claire's voice was barely audible over the roar of the earth cracking and splitting beneath them. "We can't keep running. We need to find a way to fight this." Daniel knew she was right. Their flight was futile. The curse was not something they could outrun. He scanned their surroundings, searching for any sign, any clue that might lead them to the heart of the curse. But the landscape was a twisted, barren expanse, offering no shelter, no refuge. Then, through the fog and darkness, Daniel spotted something in the distance, a faint glimmer of light, flickering like a distant star. It was the first sign of anything other than desolation they had seen since entering the mirror. "There!" Daniel shouted, pointing towards the light. "We need to head that way." Claire nodded, though her face was pale with fear and exhaustion. "Let's go," she agreed, her voice trembling. They changed direction, running towards the distant light with renewed determination. The ground continued to crumble beneath their feet, but they pushed forward, driven by the hope that the light would lead them to the source of the curse and a way to destroy it. As they neared the light, the fog began to thin, revealing a massive stone structure rising out of the barren landscape. The structure was ancient, its surface covered in strange, unreadable symbols that seemed to pulse with an eerie glow. At the center of the structure was a large, ornate door, and the light they had seen was emanating from a crack in the door's surface. "This must be it," Claire whispered, her voice filled with a mixture of awe and dread. "The heart of the curse." Daniel reached out and touched the door, the stone cold and smooth under his fingers. As he did, the symbols on the door flared to life, glowing brighter as the heartbeat in the air grew louder, faster. "We have to go inside," Daniel said, his voice firm despite the fear gnawing at him. "Whatever is in there, it's the source of all of this. We have to destroy it." Claire swallowed hard, nodding in agreement. "Let's do this," she said, her voice shaking but determined. Together, they pushed against the heavy stone door. It groaned in protest, the ancient hinges creaking as it slowly began to open. The light inside was blinding, forcing them to shield their eyes as they stepped through the doorway. When their eyes adjusted, they found themselves standing in a vast chamber, the walls lined with more of the strange, glowing symbols. In the center of the chamber was a massive, pulsating heart, suspended in midair by chains of light. The heart was the source of the light and the relentless, echoing heartbeat that had haunted them since they entered the mansion. It's alive, Claire breathed, horror and disbelief in her voice. How is that possible? Daniel stared at the heart, revulsion and fear warring within him. The heart seemed to pulse with a life of its own, each beat sending ripples of dark energy through the chamber. He knew instinctively that this was the source of the curse, the heart of the evil that had corrupted the mansion and claimed so many lives. We have to destroy it, Daniel said, his voice resolute. It's the only way to end this. But how? Claire asked, her voice shaking. How do we destroy something like this? As if in answer, the chains of light holding the heart in place began to vibrate, sending waves of energy through the chamber. The walls started to tremble, and the symbols on them flared brighter, as if the heart was reacting to their presence, aware of the threat they posed. We have to act fast, Daniel urged. Look for anything we can use, anything that might break those chains or damage the heart. They quickly scanned the chamber, their eyes darting from one ancient symbol to another. In the far corner of the room, Claire spotted a pedestal with a large, ceremonial dagger placed upon it. The blade gleamed with an unnatural light, and the hilt was covered in the same symbols that adorned the walls. Daniel, look, Claire called out, rushing over to the pedestal. This might be what we need. Daniel followed her, his eyes widening as he saw the dagger. It has to be, he agreed. This is no ordinary weapon. It was meant to kill whatever that thing is. Without hesitation, Claire grabbed the dagger, the hilt warm in her hand as if it was alive. As she held it, the symbols on the blade began to glow, resonating with the pulsating heart in the center of the chamber. This is it, Daniel, Claire said, her voice filled with a mixture of fear and determination. We have to use this to destroy the heart. Daniel nodded, taking a deep breath. Let's do it together, he said, placing his hand over hers on the hilt of the dagger. With their hands joined, they approached the pulsating heart. The energy in the room intensified, the heartbeat growing louder and faster, as if the heart was aware of the danger and was trying to defend itself. The chains of light began to vibrate more violently, sending sparks of energy crackling through the air. As they reached the heart, the ground beneath them shook violently, and the air grew thick with the stench of decay. The heart pulsed with an almost frantic rhythm, the dark energy radiating from it becoming almost unbearable. Now! Daniel shouted, and together they plunged the dagger into the heart. The moment the blade pierced the pulsating flesh, a deafening scream filled the chamber, reverberating off the walls with a sound that was both human and inhuman. The heart convulsed violently, the chains of light snapping one by one as the energy within it was released. Claire and Daniel were thrown back by the force of the explosion, the chamber shaking as the heart disintegrated, its dark energy unraveling into nothingness. The walls of the chamber cracked and crumbled, the symbols fading as the curse was finally broken. The last thing they saw before the world went dark was the heart collapsing in on itself, disappearing into a void of light and shadow. When Claire and Daniel awoke, they found themselves lying on the floor of the small, dilapidated house. The mirror was shattered, its pieces scattered around them, like shards of a broken dream. The air was still. The oppressive weight of the curse lifted at last. They sat up slowly, disoriented, but alive. The heartbeat was gone. The dark energy that had surrounded them dissipated. We did it, Claire whispered, her voice filled with awe and relief. It's over. Daniel nodded, his body aching but his heart light. "We broke the curse," he said, a smile forming on his lips. "It's finally over." They stood up, helping each other to their feet, and looked around the room. The house was still old and crumbling, but it no longer felt malevolent. The darkness that had haunted it for so long was gone, leaving only the remnants of a once grand home. As they stepped outside into the cool night air, they both felt a sense of peace wash over them. The mansion in the distance was dark and silent, no longer glowing with the eerie light that had once filled its windows. "It's really over," Claire said, taking a deep breath of the fresh, untainted air. Daniel wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. "Yes," he said softly, "we're free." They walked away from the house, the horrors of Hollow Manor now behind them. The road ahead was long, but they knew they could face it together, stronger for having survived the curse that had once threatened to consume them. As they left the cursed grounds behind, the first light of dawn began to break on the horizon, a new day rising on a world free from the shadows of the past. Story 2. The Whispering Shadows. The small town of Ravenwood had always been a place where nothing much happened. Tucked away in a remote corner of the countryside, it was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and life moved at a slow, predictable pace. The townsfolk were content with their quiet lives, surrounded by the thick woods that bordered the town on all sides. But that all changed when the shadows came. It started with little things. People would catch glimpses of movement out of the corner of their eye, only to find nothing there when they turned to look. Doors that had been securely locked would be found ajar, and strange, whispering voices could be heard in the dead of night, murmuring in a language no one could understand. At first, the townsfolk dismissed it as their imagination, the product of too many late nights and too little sleep. But as the incidents became more frequent and the whispers grew louder, fear began to take hold. Something was wrong in Ravenwood, something far darker than anyone could have imagined. One by one, the townspeople began to vanish. They would leave their homes in the evening, only to never return. Search parties scoured the woods and nearby areas, but no trace of the missing could be found. The only clue left behind was the faint sound of whispering, growing fainter and fainter, as if it was being carried away by the wind. Panic gripped the town as the disappearances continued. The once tight-knit community was now torn apart by suspicion and fear. People barricaded themselves in their homes at night, praying they wouldn't be the next to vanish. The town's old legends were whispered once more, tales of dark forces lurking in the woods, of ancient spirits that could never be satisfied. Amidst this growing terror, two of Ravenwood's residents, Amelia and Henry, decided to take matters into their own hands. Amelia was a school teacher, known for her sharp mind and unyielding determination. Henry, a carpenter, was practical and brave, always ready to face a challenge head-on. They had grown up together in Ravenwood, and the recent horrors had only strengthened their bond. "We can't just sit here and wait for whatever this is to take us to," Amelia said one evening, her voice filled with resolve. "We need to find out what's happening and put a stop to it." Henry nodded in agreement, his face set in a determined frown. "We need to protect our town," he replied. "But where do we even start? We've searched everywhere, and we haven't found a single clue." Amelia thought for a moment, then spoke. "What about the old church? It's been abandoned for years, ever since the fire. No one goes near it anymore, but maybe there's something there." Something we've missed. Henry hesitated. The old church on the outskirts of town was a place most people avoided. It had been partially destroyed in a fire decades ago, and the ruins were said to be haunted. But Amelia was right. If they were going to find any answers, they had to look in the places everyone else was too afraid to go. All right, Henry agreed, determination hardening his voice. We'll go to the church tonight, but we need to be careful. Whatever's been taking people, it might be there too. As night fell, the two friends made their way to the edge of town, where the old church stood in the shadow of the trees. The building was a crumbling relic of another time, its stone walls blackened by fire and overgrown with ivy. The steeple had collapsed long ago, and the stained glass windows were shattered, their colorful shards scattered across the ground. They approached the church with caution, the whispering wind sending chills down their spines. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decay, and the darkness seemed to press in on them from all sides. "Stay close," Henry whispered, his voice barely audible over the rustling leaves. "We don't know what we're dealing with." Amelia nodded, clutching the small lantern they had brought to light their way. The feeble glow barely penetrated the darkness, casting long, eerie shadows that danced across the ruins. As they stepped inside the church, the temperature dropped sharply, and the whispering that had haunted the town seemed to grow louder, echoing off the walls in a dissonant chorus. Amelia and Henry exchanged a nervous glance, their breath visible in the frigid air. The interior of the church was a scene of desolation. Pews lay broken and scattered, the altar was cracked and crumbling, and the once beautiful frescoes on the walls were now faded and covered in grime. But there was something else, too, something that didn't belong. In the center of the room, where the fire had burned the hottest, the stone floor was cracked and uneven, as if something had burst through from below. The cracks formed a jagged pattern, almost like a symbol, and at the heart of it, the stone was blackened and smooth, as though it had been melted. This wasn't caused by the fire," Amelia said, her voice trembling with unease. "Something else did this. Something powerful." Henry knelt down, examining the cracks more closely. "These symbols, they're like the ones in the old books," he said. "The ones about the rituals and the old gods. But these are different, more twisted, more chaotic." As they stared at the cracked floor, the whispering grew louder, more insistent, as if urging them to leave, to run while they still could. But Amelia and Henry stood their ground, determined to uncover the truth. "We need to find out what's beneath this," Amelia said, her voice firm despite the fear gnawing at her. "Whatever it is, it's the source of all this." Henry nodded, though he felt a deep, primal fear rising within him. He retrieved a crowbar from his backpack and began prying at the stones, his muscles straining as he worked. The whispering grew louder still, the voices now forming words in a language neither of them could understand. Finally, with a sharp crack, one of the stones came loose, revealing a dark, gaping hole beneath it. The smell of damp earth and something far more foul wafted up from the darkness below. Amelia held the lantern over the hole, peering down into the blackness. A narrow staircase descended into the earth, the steps slick with moisture and covered in ancient, unreadable symbols. "This must be where it's coming from," Amelia said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We have to go down." Henry hesitated, but then nodded. "We've come this far," he said, though his heart pounded in his chest. "We can't turn back now." With a deep breath, they descended the staircase, the whispering growing louder with each step they took. The air grew thicker, the smell of decay more overpowering, until they reached the bottom and found themselves in a small, circular chamber. The walls of the chamber were lined with more symbols, glowing faintly in the darkness. In the center of the room stood a stone pedestal, and upon it lay an ancient, tattered book, its pages yellowed with age and stained with dark, unidentifiable substances. Amelia approached the book cautiously, her hand trembling as she reached out to touch it. The moment her fingers brushed the cover, the whispering ceased abruptly, leaving behind an oppressive silence that seemed to press in on them from all sides. Henry shivered, the sudden silence even more unnerving than the whispers. "What is this place?" he asked, his voice barely more than a breath. Amelia opened the book, her eyes scanning the pages. The text was written in the same strange language as the symbols on the walls, but the images, dark, twisted depictions of rituals and sacrifices, were all too clear. "This is a grimoire," Amelia said, her voice filled with dread. "An ancient one, from long before the church was built. It's a record of dark rituals, summoning something from another world." Henry felt a chill run down his spine. "What did they summon?" he asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. Amelia flipped through the pages, her eyes widening in horror. "They summoned a shadow," she said, her voice trembling. "A creature of darkness that feeds on fear and despair. It was bound here, trapped beneath the earth. But the fire must have weakened the seal," Henry finished, understanding dawning on him. "And now it's loose, feeding on the people of Ravenwood." Amelia nodded, her face pale. "We need to find a way to stop it. There has to be a way to seal it back, to banish it for good." She flipped through the grimoire frantically, searching for any mention of how to reverse the ritual. But the pages seemed to shift and blur before her eyes, the text twisting into unreadable shapes. "It's not letting me read it," Amelia said, frustration and fear in her voice. "It knows we're trying to stop it." Henry looked around the chamber, his eyes landing on a small alcove in the wall. Inside, there was a stone dagger, its blade carved with the same symbols as those in the book. "Maybe this is what we need," Henry said, retrieving the dagger. "The grimoire might be warded, but this dagger, it's part of the ritual. Maybe we can use it to break the seal, to banish the shadow." Amelia stared at the dagger, a mix of hope and fear in her eyes. "It's worth a try," she said. "But we need to be careful. If we make a mistake..." She didn't need to finish the sentence. They both knew the stakes were high. If they failed, the shadow would continue to feed, growing stronger until it consumed the entire town. With the dagger in hand, they approached the pedestal once more. Amelia began to recite the words from the grimoire, as best as she could decipher them, her voice steady despite the terror that gnawed at her insides. Henry held the dagger over the book, ready to strike at the moment the ritual required. As Amelia's voice rose in intensity, the symbols on the walls began to glow brighter, and the air around them seemed to hum with dark energy. The ground beneath them trembled, and the whispering returned, louder than ever, filling the chamber with a cacophony of voices. "Now, Henry!" Amelia shouted, her voice barely audible over the din. Henry plunged the dagger into the center of the book, piercing through the pages with a sharp, resounding crack. The instant the blade connected with the ancient paper, the whispering exploded into a deafening roar, shaking the very walls of the chamber. The symbols on the walls flared with blinding light, casting the room into stark, nightmarish relief. The book convulsed, as if alive, the pages writhing beneath the dagger as dark, inky tendrils of shadow began to spill from the wound in its center. The tendrils twisted and writhed in the air, coiling around the dagger and Amelia's outstretched hand. "Hold on!" Henry yelled, trying to pull her away, but the shadows tightened their grip, pulling them both closer to the pedestal. Amelia gritted her teeth, her voice straining as she continued to chant the incantation, forcing the words out despite the crushing pressure of the shadowy tendrils. The symbols on the walls pulsed with an ominous rhythm, the light flickering wildly as if battling against the darkness that sought to consume them. "Don't stop," Henry urged, his voice laced with desperation. He knew that if Amelia faltered, even for a moment, the ritual would fail, and the shadow would overwhelm them. As Amelia continued the incantation, the shadows seemed to waver, the tendrils recoiling slightly from the dagger. Sensing this, Henry grasped the hilt of the dagger with both hands, using all his strength to drive it deeper into the book. The moment the blade sank further into the grimoire, the chamber was filled with a blinding flash of light, accompanied by a bone-rattling shockwave that knocked both Amelia and Henry off their feet. The shadows recoiled violently, shrieking in agony as they were sucked back into the book, their dark forms dissolving into wisps of smoke. The grimoire itself began to burn, the pages curling and blackening as an unnatural fire consumed it from within. The symbols on the walls flickered one last time before fading into nothingness, leaving the chamber in complete darkness. For a few tense moments, all was silent. The oppressive presence that had filled the chamber was gone, the air now still and cold. Amelia and Henry lay on the ground, dazed and breathing heavily, their bodies aching from the force of the ritual. Slowly, Henry pushed himself up, his vision still swimming from the blast of light. "Amelia, are you all right?" he called out, his voice shaky. Amelia groaned as she sat up, her hand trembling as she rubbed her head. "I think so," she replied, her voice hoarse. Did we do it?" Henry looked around the chamber, the darkness now complete, save for the faint glow of the dying embers of the grimoire. The shadows were gone, the oppressive energy lifted, and the room felt normal, or as normal as a cursed chamber could feel. "I think we did," he said, relief flooding his voice. "The shadow's gone. It's over." Amelia let out a shaky breath, her body sagging with exhaustion. "We need to get out of here," she said, her voice still trembling, "before something else happens." Henry nodded in agreement, helping her to her feet. They stumbled back up the narrow staircase, their legs heavy and their minds reeling from the events of the night. The church above was still as desolate as before, but the atmosphere had changed. The whispers were gone, and the oppressive weight that had hung over the place for so long had lifted. They made their way out of the church and into the cool night air, the sight of the stars overhead a welcome relief after the darkness they had just escaped. For a moment, they simply stood there, breathing in the fresh air, grateful to be alive. "We need to tell the others," Amelia said after a moment, her voice quiet but firm. "We need to let the town know that it's over, that they're safe." Henry nodded, though the exhaustion in his body made the prospect of walking back to town daunting. "We'll tell them," he agreed. "But first, we need to rest. We've been through hell tonight." Amelia smiled weakly. "That's an understatement," she said. "But you're right. Let's find somewhere safe and wait for daylight." They walked back towards the town, their steps slow and heavy with fatigue. The fear that had gripped Ravenwood for so long had finally loosened its hold, and though the town would never be the same, they had saved it from a fate far worse than death. As they neared the edge of the woods, the first light of dawn began to break over the horizon, casting the town in a soft, golden glow. The nightmare was over, and with it, the dark days that had plagued Ravenwood. But even as they looked back at the church, its silhouette stark against the morning sky, they couldn't shake the feeling that something still lingered, something ancient and malevolent, waiting for the right moment to return. For now, though, they had won. And as they walked into the town they had fought so hard to protect, they knew that, whatever came next, they would face it together.